The African sky was strangely silent that morning. Normally, life begins at first light, with birdsong from the bush, jackal's cries echoing across the steppe and monkey screams from the trees. But today, the silence was much deeper. It smelled like danger. And this silence foreshadowed something. Orwin Vale stood motionless on the damp earth, his eyes fixed on the sky. He wore an old hat on his head and a ranger jacket worn by the years. His eyes were squinted, just listening to the wind. But this morning, not even the wind spoke. He had lived in this reserve for 12 years. Every morning for 12 years, before he woke up, he had learned what lurked in the silence. And in that moment, a voice whispered to him, "Today will be a different day." That difference, just a few hours later, would turn into an event that no scientist in the world could explain. But first there was Bruvo. The big boy, as he called him, Bruvo, was sitting calmly in the shade of a tree a few meters away. He was watching Orwin with a serene expression on his face and big black eyes. He was no ordinary gorilla. His eyes had not been this deep when she had rescued him from a wire trap left by poachers years ago, when he was a baby. Now, there was something almost human in his gaze. Understanding? Loyalty? Or a reminder of the past, perhaps all of it. Orwin always used to say, "Bruvo, this is the voice of the forest. But it speaks in its silence." And now, Bruvo was silent, too. That morning they were on their normal route for patrol. Orwin would walk ahead, Bruvo would follow a few meters behind him. Sometimes he would climb a high branch and look ahead into the forest, sometimes he would wait quietly in place. But this time, something was different. Bruvo stopped suddenly. He took a breath. He turned his head slightly to the side. He pricked up his ears. Then suddenly, with frightening speed, he ran deeper into the forest. And at that moment, Orwin's heart squeezed for the first time. That it was not normal for Bruvo to behave like this. As Orwin ran after him, 1,000 possibilities swirled in his mind. Poachers? An injured animal? Another group of gorillas? But deep down inside, he had a feeling this was different. The run lasted about 5 minutes. But the forest was so dense, so complex, that with every step thorny branches, rotten leaves and shadows tried to swallow Orwin. Then, when Bruvo came to a clearing, he stopped. He was tense, alert and panting. When Orwin reached him, his eyes could not believe what he saw. A lion, the king of the jungle. His golden mane gleamed faintly in the sunlight, but this proud creature was lying on the ground. His hind leg, caught in a trap. The wire had snagged hard around the bone, cutting into the flesh, blood pouring to the ground. The lion growled, but more out of anger than pain. And most incredible of all, Bruvo, the giant gorilla, stood in front of that lion, looking at him. No, it wasn't just staring. Bruvo tilted his head slightly. His eyes were soft. He was slowly reaching out his hand towards the lion. It was as if he was talking to him. And the lion did not retreat. On the contrary, he lowered his head slightly to the ground. As if asking a gorilla for help. Orwin rubbed his eyes. What he was seeing was against the laws of nature. Gorillas and lions were not even competitors. Because they didn't share the same space. They didn't speak the same language. But here, silence spoke. And in that silence, a connection had been made. No. Orwin said to himself. This can't just be a coincidence. At that moment, the lion stopped growling. He just looked at Bruvo. And Bruvo looked at him. Two different species, two different lives, but they had one thing in common: pain. Bruvo's past trap wound, Tharun's present wound, had brought them together, and Orwin just watched. Doing nothing. That it was an instinct that came from his respect for nature. He didn't intervene. He just watched. Because for the first time, a lion was bowing to a gorilla for help. Minutes passed. The sun rose. And then, there was a sound in the distance. A crackling in the bushes. Then the muffled sound of an engine. Orwin's eyes suddenly darkened. Because he knew exactly what that sound was. The poachers were returning. That wire trap was not a simple coincidence. It was a planned hunt. And Tharun was just a victim. Orwin acted immediately. He turned on his radio, but the signal was weak. Help could be a long time coming. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small first aid kit. He approached the trap, carefully addressing Tharun. "Okay, buddy, calm down. I'm helping." The lion raised his head slightly. His eyes were covered in blood, but when he looked at Orwin, there was no anger. Only surrender. Just then, Bruvo intervened. He stood in front of Orwin with his big arms. He took a few steps and looked into the bushes. Strangely, he was the first to recognize the danger. His eyes suddenly sparked. He punched his chest. And he cried out that it was a battle cry that echoed through the forest. Bruvo suddenly climbed up on the rocks. From there he looked down and landed on the ground with a huge body. Just then, the bushes parted. Two men appeared with rifles. They had their eyes on Tharun. But then, they paused when they saw Bruvo. Then they noticed Orwin. Everything happened in a few seconds. An explosion, then a shout, then silence again, but this was a different silence. Different from before. This was nature's silent revenge, and the story was just beginning. Orwin Vale had always been a lonely man. He hadn't chosen it. Life had forced it upon him. He had learned at a very young age how fragile, how temporary it was to trust in man. But nature never lied. The sound of the wind was not a lie. If it was raining, it was really raining. If an animal was afraid, there was real danger. And when there was silence, there was a reason. That's why Orwin's story began in that forest. It was many years ago, deep in Africa, patrolling this protected area. He had suspected the same silence. He had heard that thin, trembling voice at first. A shuddering, desperate, tiny cry. It didn't sound like a human voice. But it was the closest thing to human, the sound of a creature in pain, and he followed that sound. When he passed through the thorns and reached the roots of a giant tree, he saw her. A tiny, jet-black baby gorilla, trembling with fear. His arm was almost severed. The thin wire had penetrated the flesh. His skin was torn, blood and mud mixed together. But his eyes, those eyes, for the first time, something pierced Orwin's heart. There was no asking for help in those eyes, there was giving up. A baby gorilla that gives up, he muttered that day. Humans even taught him that. He had cut the wire trap. He approached slowly and took the tiny body in his arms. The cub growled at first. It tried to bite. But it was so weak, it could only lift its head. Then, it laid its neck on Orwin's arm, and in that moment, his life changed. He gave that cub a name. Bruvo. It meant like no one else, not like anyone else. Days, months, years passed. Bruvo survived. He got better. He grew. But not just his body. His heart grew too. His soul was still scarred by that wound. That's why she was always around Orwin. She didn't abandon him. Because she knew. No matter how much people feared him, he was something else to Orwin Vale. Not just an animal. Not just a bodyguard. He was family to her. And one day, Bruvo grew up. He really grew. Not only did he become one of the largest gorillas in Africa, but also the quietest and most observant. He could hear the slightest sound in the forest. He could feel the slightest change in the air. Orwin always looked where Bruvo looked. Bruvo's silence was his alarm, but that morning, Bruvo was acting stranger than ever. Imagine, as a man who has patrolled the jungle for years, you see the gorilla behind you suddenly stop, squint and look off into the distance. As if he doesn't understand it either, he sniffs the ground with his characteristic deep breath. He listens, then suddenly, without warning, he starts running like mad. Orwin had never seen anything like it, so he ran after it without blinking an eye. And do you know where Bruvo led him? Into a trap. but not just any trap, a trap that everyone in the jungle feared, the trap of the king of the land. The proudest being in Africa, a lion, Tharun. Until that moment, Tharun was a myth. Never to be approached, never to be helped. The famous lion with the golden mane, whose name even hunters whispered, and now, that golden mane, was covered in blood, and that lion, was kneeling in front of a gorilla. That first glance between Bruvo and Tharun, was the strangest thing Orwin would ever forget. The silence of that moment, that meeting of eyes, was so powerful that it was as if all the laws of nature had been broken. At that moment Orwin realized, this story was not going to be an ordinary story, because here, another form of survival was being written: man, gorilla, lion, not enemies, allies. But the real danger was yet to come, because that engine noise was the first harbinger of the nightmare Orwin would never forget. And now, for the first time, Bruvo was preparing, not for anger, not for protection, but for something else. Orwin felt it, because in Bruvo's eyes that morning, there was no old wounded gorilla, there was someone else, an entire forest, trapped inside a single body. And that body was about to fight, and not for his own kingdom, for the first time, for another. King. Bruvo's sudden change of demeanor always kept Orwin Vale on his toes. Because this giant gorilla didn't just behave like an animal. Having raised him for years, Orwin knew this: if Bruvo sensed something, something was definitely wrong in the jungle. That's exactly what happened that morning. Bruvo's gaze suddenly changed, his eyes darkened, his whole body went on high alert. And at that moment, without hesitation, he started running like a madman. Orwin followed him without a second thought. As he quickened his pace, the only thought that crossed his mind was, "What did you see again, big boy?" Bruvo's footsteps shook the ground and disappeared among the branches and leaves. It was hard to stay behind him. Because this giant body was almost flying. Orwin was panting, dragging himself more and more among the thorns with each step, not caring about the branches that pricked his body. Because he knew. Every moment Bruvo ran like this, a life would be saved or it would be over. Minutes passed, but Bruvo did not stop. He didn't look back, he didn't slow down. Until, he reached the clearing. As Orwin took the last step, his eyes widened, his heart stopped for a moment. No. No, he was not prepared to see such a thing. For what lay before him was Africa's most fearless being. Tharun, the undisputed king of the jungle with the golden mane, the massive body, the undisputed king of the jungle. Now he lay on the ground, bloodied and writhing in agony, caught in the grip of a trap, but that's not what made Orwin's eyes widen. It was Tharun's eyes that shocked him, eyes that looked at him in despair. Those eyes, so proud, so fearless, now held only pain. But there was something else hidden in them. A strangeness. A break. A surrender. In that moment, Tharun was not growling. He wasn't attacking. He wasn't baring his teeth. Rather, it was as if he was asking for help. And the only person he expected that help from was Bruvo. It was the strangest scene Orwin had ever seen: the king of the jungle, the lion, bowing down to a gorilla, and Bruvo, slowly, bending his giant body, approached Tharun. He reached out his hand towards his face. No one could have witnessed such a moment. But Orwin was. Orwin watched in shock. Because this was not nature's own written law. This was something else. But the silence didn't last long, because suddenly, that familiar voice echoed, the sound of an engine, and then, metallic footsteps. Orwin's blood drained. Poachers. No, this was no ordinary hunt. This trap was no ordinary trap. Everything was planned. Everything was much more organized. Catching a giant like Tharun couldn't have been simple. They had obviously been watching for a long time. And now, they were coming back. Orwin immediately crouched down. Bruvo narrowed his eyes and looked deep into the forest. Even Tharun lifted his head and looked in that direction. The only thing that went through Orwin's mind at that moment was this: I can't make it. There is no help. The only way to survive here is, together. Orwin hurried to Tharun's side. He looked around. He examined the trap. The blood was flowing freely. The wire was against the bone. At every touch, Tharun growled but did not attack. It was as if he was patient. Bruvo was up on a rock at that moment. He was observing with his huge body. And then, that famous sound. Bruvo's guttural, deep, powerful, resonant war cry. The poachers stopped for a few seconds. Orwin seized the opportunity. He took a small knife from his pocket. With trembling hands, he began to cut the wire. Every second, the sound of the engine came closer, the footsteps grew louder. Bruvo climbed down the rocks. On the other hand, he was watching around Orwin. With a final thrust, the wire was cut. Tharun jumped in pain. But he still couldn't walk. His wound was deep. The bleeding hadn't stopped at that moment. Something happened that no one could have predicted. Tharun turned his head toward Bruvo, and that giant lion tried to stand up, but he couldn't. Bruvo stood still for a few seconds, then he approached Tharun and turned his back to him. No, this is no joke. Orwin's eyes widened in horror. Tharun leaned on Bruvo's back. That a lion, walking with the support of a gorilla. Orwin's eyes filled with tears. A moment like this was once in a lifetime, but there was no time. The poachers finally appeared. Two of them, rifles in their hands. Their target was Tharun. But there was one thing they didn't count on, that Tharun was no longer alone. Bruvo rushed forward. He hit the ground with all his might. His scream filled the forest. And Orwin knew in that moment, today, here, all the rules of nature would change. The cry from Bruvo's chest spread throughout the forest. That sound was not just a warning. It was a declaration of war. And with that cry, a region that had been silent for years suddenly began to stir. The branches trembled. Leaves shook. Birds in the air suddenly took wing. The heart of the forest began to beat. And Tharun just stood there, leaning on Bruvo's back. A wild lion leaning on a gorilla. The image was startling but real. But no one had time to think about what it meant. Because a few seconds later, the first man emerged from the bushes. A man dressed in black, his face masked, carrying a rifle with a silencer. Then another one. And another. They surrounded the perimeter in silence. Their eyes were on the prey. They recognized Tharun's weakness. Their target was clear. But their plans were thwarted when a huge black silhouette stepped out of the shadows. Bruvo stood up on his 2 feet. His hair stood on end, his chest rising and falling, his eyes locked on the target. He was no longer an animal, but a warrior. The poachers paused for a moment. They tried to understand what had happened. What they saw was unlike anything they would ever see in the wild. A gorilla, but not just any gorilla. Huge, deliberate, angry. One of them raised his gun, took aim. And that's when Orwin fell to the ground. His heart was beating in his mouth. He wanted to scream no, but he couldn't make a sound. The trigger would be pulled. Bruvo would die. But he didn't. Because Tharun, at that moment he jumped in front of Bruvo. Yes, a lion that couldn't walk, ferocious, proud, wounded, he took cover to protect a gorilla. The trigger was not pulled. Because the hunters were stunned. Here was a lion and a gorilla cooperating. It was completely irrational. And that irrationality momentarily upset the usual balance. Orwin seized the opportunity. He crouched down on the ground and quickly pulled an emergency flare from his backpack. He tried to light it, shaking his hand rapidly. But the matches were damp. His fingers were sweaty. Each time he tried, they slipped out of his hand. Time was running out. Suddenly, Bruvo leapt to the ground and got on all fours. Crushing the branches, he leapt at the hunter at the front in one fell swoop. A scream. A gunshot. Then silence. Then chaos. The second man backed away in panic. Tharun let out a growl. Despite his wound, he showed his teeth. For a few seconds, he was king again. The moment had to be seized. Orwin finally struck a match. He threw the flare into the sky. The red flame rose like a star above the forest. And then it exploded. Not loud, but loud. It was colorful. The sentries in the distance, if they were in the right place, would see it. But when would help arrive? Bruvo had neutralized the hunter he had knocked down, but the others were recovering fast. The third man pointed a gun from behind a distant rock. It took him a second to aim. But in that second, Bruvo leapt behind Tharun and stood to cover the lion. The trigger was pulled. The bullet tore through the air. Orwin's lungs constricted. It was as if time stopped. But they hadn't been shot. The bullet grazed Bruvo's shoulder. A drop of blood fell to the ground. Bruvo did not retreat. He kept his eyes on his enemy. And then, something happened that no one expected. A second scream came from the forest. But it wasn't Bruvo's. It was another gorilla and another. And then another. Then the trees shook. Branches snapped. And dark trunks began to emerge one by one from the shadows. Bruvo was not alone. There was someone watching him. From afar. Silently. Perhaps for years. Others who saw his struggle, shared his pain, understood his loyalty, others. Maybe his brothers from the past. Maybe another exile from deeper in the forest. But in that moment, Bruvo was not alone. The poachers began to retreat in terror. They couldn't understand what had happened. They had come to hunt a lion. But they were up against an army. An army that thinks like men, that acts together, that protects, that fights, an army. And at their head was Bruvo. He gave orders with his eyes. They didn't charge forward. They just surrounded the perimeter. With their torsos they became a silent threat. A wall too strong to dare pull the trigger. And then a sound echoed over the forest. The rotor of a helicopter. Engines in the distance. Help was coming. The poachers understood. It was over. But they couldn't escape. Because the shadow of a gorilla covered every path they could take. They put down their guns. They raised their hands. Silence fell. Orwin fell to his knees. He couldn't breathe. He held his head with his hands. Because he was alive. Because Bruvo was alive. Or because Tharun was still breathing. She didn't know. Tears welled up in his eyes. For the first time in his life, he felt truly protected. But it wasn't the humans. Tharun turned his eyes to Orwin. Then Bruvo. Their eyes were tired, but something else shone in them. Respect. Maybe even thanks. Bruvo came closer and touched him. His big fingers brushed gently against Tharun's bloodied shoulder. It was a greeting. Perhaps it was a farewell. An alliance. A final bond. And in that moment, the forest fell silent. Literally silent, the landing of the helicopter, the shouts of the reinforcements, the sound of handcuffs, it was all in the distance. This story did not begin with their voices. And it would not end with their voices. The real heroes of the jungle didn't speak. But everything they said, echoed in the soul. There was only one news story that told what happened that day in the middle of the forest. Poachers caught. A lion rescued. But no one knew about Bruvo's cry, Tharun's sacrifice, Orwin's tears, the friendship that echoed through the forest that day, and perhaps this story was valuable, not when it was told, but when it was lived. The sound of the helicopter faded into the background, the footsteps of the poachers mingled with the cuffs. The sky was already darkening and the forest was preparing for night. But for Orwin Vale, time had stopped. His hands were still shaking. His heart was still beating in his chest. His mind could not comprehend what he had seen that day, his logic rejected it. But his soul, his spirit was silently saying yes in a completely different way. Because sometimes nature speaks the language of emotion, not logic. And for the first time in his life, Orwin understood so clearly, animals were not just animals. They still carried something that humans had forgotten. Compassion. Loyalty. A devotion so pure that they were willing to pay the price. Bruvo was sitting quietly, leaning against the trunk of a tree. The wound on his shoulder was bandaged, but blood was still dripping onto the ground. Tharun was a few meters away, his body on the ground. His breathing was slow but deep. His eyes were closed. It was as if he was dreaming. Maybe he was really dreaming. Because he had never expected a gorilla to save him when not even his own kind could help him. Maybe his pride had been hurt, but he had survived. And sometimes, life was worth more than pride. As night fell, camp was set up. The team secured the area. Orwin didn't want to talk. Not to anyone. He just looked at the fire. He had a cup in his hand, but there was nothing in it. His mind was full, his soul was tired. But his eyes kept moving in the same direction. Bruvo. The hero who sat like a silent shadow, demanding nothing, expecting no reward, that hero. There was a crackle in the midnight silence. Orwin sat up immediately. He reached for his gun, but then stopped. The sound, it was not a footstep. It was soft. Balanced. Emotional. And then, a figure emerged from the darkness. Tharun. He walked slowly, with his wounded body. No one had forced him. No one expected anything from him. But he came. He headed straight for Bruvo. She searched his eyes with her eyes. Bruvo raised his head. The two gazes collided. A long, deep, silent stare. And then Tharun approached. He rested his big head on Bruvo's shoulder. The silence spoke again. It was the language of the forest. No words were needed, and at that moment, a gunshot echoed through the forest, tearing the night. Orwin jumped up. The camp sounded the alarm. Everyone scrambled in panic. But the gunshot had come not from the camp, but from far away. And a second sound, closer. This time it was automatic. Short, clipped. And then silence. Orwin immediately turned on the radio. He changed the frequency. He tried to contact the other protection teams, but there was no answer. It wasn't possible. Help had arrived. The area was secured. Wasn't it? What if the poachers weren't alone? What if this was just a fragment? At that moment, a pang shot through his heart. Because the first thing that came into his vision was Bruvo's face. And then Tharun. They were too close to danger. Orwin quickly grabbed his flashlight. He ran out of the camp. He moved through the bosom of the night like a figure cutting through the darkness. The leaves crunched with every step. His heart pounded in his throat. And then, his eyes picked out something, blood on the tree trunk, but it wasn't human blood. Orwin checked the ground for tracks with his hands. The earth had been dug up. Footprints, drag marks, traces of carrying heavy objects. All fresh. Very fresh. Then he raised his flashlight. And you know what he saw? A mark. A thin mark carved into the bark. Bruvo's mark, the same shape he had drawn on the ground with a stone for Orwin, years ago, when he was a child. It was a message, I'm here. But it was also a warning, there is danger. Orwin turned back immediately. He alerted the other protectors. They began to follow a new trail. It was a walk in the night, against the silence. Hours passed. The moon changed. The sky turned gray. When the first rays of morning filtered through the trees, they finally found them. In a clearing, on the edge of a giant pit. Bruvo, standing upright. Fatigue in his eyes, scars on his body, but proud. Next to him was Tharun, but he was motionless. Orwin didn't want to approach, but his eyes betrayed him. His steps involuntarily quickened. He crouched next to Tharun. He listened to his breath. Deep. Heavy. But he was still there. He was alive. Bruvo stepped back. He didn't say anything. He just looked. Orwin stroked Tharun's head with his hands. A king, on the ground, covered in blood. But he was not alone, and that day, a decision was made. Tharun was moved to a rehabilitation center. Slowly he recovered. But he was never caged. Because no one can put a king in chains. Bruvo, on the other hand, was given an open area of the camp. His own space. His own life. But he didn't go. He walked with Orwin every morning. Every morning he sat under the same tree. And every morning, he looked away, because Bruvo still had the wound of the forest in his heart. Maybe that's why, one morning, at sunrise, he was gone. No one saw. No one heard. But his mark remained, another mark on the bark, same shape, same meaning. I was here. Now I ask you, why does a lion protect a gorilla? Why does a gorilla dedicate his life to a human, and why can a human never forget them? Maybe there are no answers to these questions. Maybe it's one of nature's secrets. But the truth is, that morning, in the heart of Africa, a friendship, a commitment, a miracle. So, if you were you, what would you do? If you were Orwin, if you could look into Bruvo's eyes, Tharun's eyes, do you think loyalty belongs only to human beings? Don't forget to write your thoughts in the comments. This story is not only our story, it is your story too. If you liked the video, please don't forget to press like, subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications for new stories. See you again in the next big story. Thank you, you are the silent witness to this story, but we want to hear your voice in the comments.